Thank you very much, everyone who joined tonight. This is our second week in the Liberating Cinema film series for 2021. Our first week was on Sham Benegal, which we covered, and this week I'm delighted really to introduce you to Yugoslav silent cinema. We'll start with a talk I'll give in presentation, and then we'll enter a more creative discussion. I'd like to thank Yugoslav Cinematheque in Belgrade for providing our film tonight with Faith in God, and I hope you had a chance to see it. If you didn't have a chance, I still encourage you to watch it after this. You'll have, plenty of opportunity to. And then also to read the essay we published here at Liberating Cinema, which I wrote on the cinema of Mihajlo Popović. So I'll share that with you, and I'll share my screen now. And just a moment. Right. Good. So can everyone see this, just to make sure?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Maxa. Great. So this is our week on Introduction to Yugoslav Silent Cinema. I'm going to first start, this is the still from With Faith in God from tonight's film. I'll first start by talking about the birth of film. And this kind of incorporates the period before Yugoslavia was formed, which was in 1918. And before that, we had the main country that formed Yugoslavia that was fully independent before the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was the Kingdom of Serbia. And then there were several territories, South Slavic territories, in both the North Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the south, in the Ottoman Empire, that also would then form kind of territories that would become Yugoslavia, and that were, where South Slavs lived, where Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others lived. And basically, yes, here we'll look at essentially how it all started, like in what would become the Yugoslav space. So the birth of film, initially on the 6th of June, 1896, and I love to talk about this, I'll kind of leave room for more discussion. But the first film screening in Serbia and in the Balkan Peninsula took place in Terazija Square, which you see here in Belgrade, at the Kafana at the Golden Cross. And this was quite a special, quite a spectacular occasion, because it was attended by the monarch, King Alexander Obrenović at the time. And we can, from the initial get-go of kind of film coming into Serbia and later Yugoslavia, we can see that initially there's both this connection of film, both to kind of domestic, both to the city, and we see, as in Belgrade, when the film premiered, there was an immense kind of spectacle. So it was very much connected to the people, but also was connected to the monarch, to the state. It also had a great deal of prestige endowed with it to begin with. It wasn't like, like in the Lumiere shows in Paris, which were often kind of in the dark houses and closed spaces. And for quite, as symbols of entertainment here, it was quite a much wider spectacular event that connected both people and monarchy, the country and the state. So it's quite an interesting thing to begin with. So film kind of plays a role in Serbia, and then later Yugoslavia from initially, in 1896, straight after the Lumieres kind of prepared their first screenings, they come to Belgrade. Then some other developments that I kind of highlighted here, I've done them by year. And basically in 1901, some of the key dates, this is both in Serbian historiography, but also across the different borders that existed at the time. Elektrobioskop Livka, founded in Trieste. This is one of the first cinemas founded by Slav Alexander Livka, one of the great pioneers of this period, who worked in Serbia, who later worked in Yugoslavia. I believe he was a Czech by birth, but yes, he worked in Serbia and then Yugoslavia for most of his life. In 1904, we have the first film produced in Serbia, and that's the coronation of King Peter I of Serbia. And this is also a time when we have a change of dynasty. We have now the Karađorđević dynasty, who are initially, the first royal dynasty after the Ottomans that came into Serbia, and that's connected with the first Serbian uprising. And they kind of supplanted the Obrenović dynasty, which was also, they were also very close families, but the Karađorđević dynasty now becomes the main dynasty in Serbia, and they're going to be also later the main dynasty of the new Yugoslav kingdom. In 1905, this is kind of a key date because the Manaki brothers, who are often called the Aromanian or the Balkan Lumieres, they make their first film. Grandmother Despina and Karel Grossman on his films, who's a Slovene, he makes his film in Ljutomer, and they're both kind of initial film enthusiasts that then have an immense role kind of in this early period in across the Balkan space, but especially in Serbia and across the different kind of empires that are forming at this time and who will later have an influence on Yugoslavia. The development of film is interesting because then we get 1907 is the first year we really have a cinema open in Serbia. 1908 is the first permanent cinema open in the Kingdom of Serbia. and Svetozar Botorić is a key figure of this period. And he's someone who would become one of the first film producers. He would make the film I'm going to go on to next, Karađorđe, who would produce it. But what's important to note here is that film exhibition plays a big role, and a lot of entrepreneurs and businessmen, before they get even into film production, they often get into film exhibition, and this is the route a lot of filmmakers, later filmmakers, take to making films. There are lots more interesting, also different routes that are taken, but film exhibition in the case plays a key role. And why I said at the Golden Cross, this was a kafana, which is a specifically Serbian and Balkan type of bistro, that becomes the space of the first cinemas, or hotels also, the Hotel Paris, in which Karađorđe, the first full-length motion picture, Serbian motion picture, and one of the first in the Balkans, and one of the world's first feature films, opens in Hotel Paris. And then we also have, traveling movie theaters. We have to bear in mind the whole cultural context of this time. We have traveling movie theaters, and then we have permanent cinema starting to open up, both within other spaces used for other purposes like hotels or kafanas, but we also have first permanent cinemas opening themselves too. George, I'm giving you a bit of context also, just so we have a bit of kind of background material before we really get into Yugoslav cinema, because people often, and even film historians, know very little about this period. And I'll say a bit later why that is. But I think it's important to have context and to understand what preceded the creation of a distinctly Yugoslav cinema. 1912 to 1918 is an interesting period. There are a lot of filmmakers working at this point. I'm not going to give you all of them now because I would like to kind of focus on the Yugoslav period, but one of the main ones that I really cannot leave out is Đorđe Bogdanović. And he's an incredibly important filmmaker who makes basically the most essential historical documents and cinematic documents on the Balkan Wars, and also the First World War. His crews shoot, and he immediately screens his films on a very tight schedule. So the films get shot often on the front lines, and the same week or the next week they're shown in his cinema that he owns in Belgrade. So it's a very interesting production process, and he's credited as a producer. And this is another kind of interesting aspect about filmmaking at this time, this idea of the director, who's the author of the film. While Bogdanović is a very distinct, while his films have a very distinct feeling and a very specific Bogdanović touch, at the same time, he is a producer, and he's sending different cameramen into the field. So it's this interplay of who actually makes the film, and thinking about who actually makes the film is important. But nonetheless, Bogdanović emerges, and with all this, as a very important cinematic voice in the 1910s. And what's especially fascinating is that some developments in film language are made often spontaneously, often from the grassroots, and films that are, maybe not even intended to be, milestones in the development of film language. There's a great one called The Funeral of Lieutenant Marinković. And this is just simply a film that records, a funeral of a very important kind of figure from the state. But the way it's filmed as a documentary, it introduces some fascinating techniques, that, like, for example, deep focus cinematography, through which we see this various levels of the funeral, the priests, the military, the comrades of this Lieutenant Marinković, all in one shot. And there's this interplay of, life and death, and of people in this life and then the next connected. Why this is important is deep focus is one, one of the essential cinematic techniques that would later be championed by the likes of Jean Renoir or Orson Welles. And here in the 1910s, we already see it used, and it's fascinating to appreciate. This is connected to the final point really on this slide, and as the interplay or the significance the role early pioneers played in the development of film language. In Serbia, it's quite distinct because it was one of the virtues of being a kingdom and an independent state separate from foreign influence, unlike the empires in which the other South Slavs lived at the time, is that filmmakers were able and free to make both their own cinemas, production studios, and to kind of develop themselves and confirm themselves as auteurs within their own country. Whereas this was quite difficult, or it worked at least in several different ways in the other countries that still weren't separated from occupation or foreign influence. Now, 1918 is a key year, and this is the point basically where we have Yugoslavia formed. Initially, it's called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and these are the three constitutive peoples of what would later be called Yugoslavia, the land of South Slavs. After the Second World War, you have many more nations, if you like, formed, but that's something that develops later historically. Essentially, the three peoples that are defined in the initial formation of this kingdom are Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and this land of the unity of South Slavs. There's a much more breadth of possibility open. All the film culture and heritages we see develop within Serbia, but also across the different states by South Slavs, by important pioneering filmmakers like the Manaki brothers, like Karel Grossman, now are able to make their films in a new and united kingdom. United Kingdom, I didn't intend that pun, but it works nicely. And basically to kind of really develop a significant film culture and a significant network for film production and a further development of film language. And now there's why I start with film culture is I find it interesting to talk about how film culture formed initially in Yugoslavia. And I hope I'm not going too fast. I would think we'll have some time afterwards to talk a little bit more about this in the questions part. But why I think this is essential is that a lot of, especially now when we look back, I'll say that first, kind of contextually, people who know very little about the former Yugoslavia or the Balkans for that matter, often think, especially with the formation of new successor states that are made based on the boundaries of some old ones, and boundaries always and borders always changed. I think it's important to bear in mind the kind of the historical role of film culture in the country that was known as Yugoslavia, because and I'll kind of explain later why I think that's significant. But here it's important to see how immediately from the 20s you have the first film schools opening. And to give you context, only in the Soviet Union you had a fully operational film school. In the UK, film schools would open much later. Like in the 50s, I know the London Film School is one that often credits itself as the first, but 30 years earlier, we have here the first film schools opening in Yugoslavia. Belgrade has three film schools working in the 1920s. One of the main ones is Alexander Trepov's Filmska Škola at the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts. And why this is important is that immediately from the 1920s, still a period of silent cinema, when film language is still being formulated both domestically and internationally, we already have film schools which are teaching film, where people are having the opportunity to engage with film more critically and to make films. So, and this is highly important because now if you look at historiography, there's often, especially with the new successor states, you have the idea, that they only discovered film 20 years ago. People have no idea about this early history. And it's important they know this, that we engage with this material, because we see that film schools opened as early as the early 1920s. And film criticism played a big role in Yugoslavia, and particularly in the formation of the avant-garde. And figures like Boško Tokin, people who were poets or avant-garde artists, came to film. And why I isolate Boško Tokin as a figure, just to give you context, is he's a fascinating, really poet, writer, critic, who has a big influence on the Yugoslav avant-garde. And one of his films, which is called Budi Bog s nama, God Be With Us, is kind of considered lost. So often, another thing to bear in mind is a lot of these silent films, as both in Yugoslavia but also beyond, they're often the kind of inaccessibility to this heritage, either due to them being lost or only available in archives, is something we have to deal with. So, but nonetheless, Boško Tokin, we know a lot about him and his work, and he's an important figure because he creates this avant-garde film, and later comes into clash with the communist authorities. His film is burned, but nonetheless it plays an important role as kind of one of the first pieces of avant-garde cinema in Yugoslavia. And he's really a fascinating figure because it's kind of there's a new film also being made about him, and this parallel between Belgrade and Paris in the 20s. There's a very strong parallel in terms of kind of this flourishing of aesthetic expression from the grassroots. But this is something also distinguishes Yugoslavia from the other contexts. I mentioned France, but also other countries. I'll speak about production next, but film criticism is important. This more serious engagement with film, both public engagement, but also kind of new critics who are professionalizing in film. Film clubs, societies, and journals play a big role in the 20s and 30s. There's a Yugoslav Film Society. There's another one, Klub Filmofila, who play a big role in introducing young cineasts to film. Often these people aren't, people who are engaged in film at all, but through these film clubs, through these societies, they discover film for the first time. And another thing to bear in mind, while I've kind of hinted at the grassroots aspect of Yugoslav film culture, there's also an incredible dimension in which the Karađorđević dynasty, who, as I mentioned before, was the Serbian royal family, now becomes the Yugoslav royal family. They have their own private cinema as early as the 1920s, and this is kind of, one of the most lavish private cinemas and one of the first private cinemas in the world that exists in a monarch's court, no less. And it's fascinating to kind of look at how film culture, there was a continuous interplay between, grassroots film culture that came from the people, but also that went as far as the king's court, where we have this kind of spectacular instance of film exhibition in the 1920s. And it still stands at the cinema today. If you visit Belgrade, there's still, and the royal family, there's been a kind of, this cinema has been redecorated, but it still stands intact. So the emergence of a distinct cinephilia in Yugoslavia is fascinating, and it ties to film production. Although there was state support, and I put this in this slide, monarchy played a big role in supporting educational films in particular, and documentaries as well. And this meant that a lot of pioneers who came through the film clubs, through the societies, through these, or even, that emerged themselves, were able to, get funding or get their films made. But the most important thing is that nonetheless, this all formed as a grassroots practice. And here's a massive distinction, if you do film or if you don't do film, what you often realize is that, studio systems often supplanted the actuality films, the likes of Lumiere and the Menaki brothers. They supplanted already the actuality films by the 1910s. And in countries like Britain, or in the US, or in Italy, or in Denmark for that matter, or in France, you have very you have already nationalized studio systems and a great infrastructure in those countries. And while one might seem initially that this is a limitation for Yugoslavia, that there's no such, nationalization yet, because that would only occur after the Second World War, here there's great room for creative freedom and for a different approach to film, and which would also influence a new, different approach to film language, film aesthetics, and film culture, and overall film production that's basically fostered in Yugoslavia. And that's this idea of grassroots practice. And you have self-organized film enthusiasts. And these people came from all walks of life. And it not only included those who might seem to be connected with film, like you imagine, from the theater, which there were, theater, literature, art, but it also included businessmen, as I mentioned, inventors, traders, printers, journalists, military officers, or my most fascinating one is policemen. And they just take cameras and start filming. And now, while this is, in our present context in the 2020s, we can think, yeah, anyone can start filming and upload it to YouTube. If you can take yourself back over 100 years, this is remarkable. And how they, their even ability to get their hands on film, to get them screened, to get them shown, to learn about film, and to also kind of invent new techniques, and moreover, kind of really develop a unique sense of cinematic expression, a unique film language, is something that makes Yugoslav cinema and the silent period of Yugoslav cinema one of the most exceptional chapters in film history. I've given, because I realize I've talked a lot, I've given some examples of pioneers here. This is not an exhaustive list. And because the New Kingdom is quite large, that incorporates a lot of the previous territories, like I mentioned, of Austro-Hungarian Empire, of the Ottoman Empire, and that includes all the 6 republics that would later become, after the war, the 6 republics of Yugoslavia. Some of the main pioneers include Kosta Novaković, Josip Novak, some of them who came through these film clubs that I mentioned, Miodrag Đorđević, Stevan Mišković, Žarko Đorđević, Andrija and Zarija Đokić. Some of these people don't have, their films are sometimes lost, we have fragments, but some you can still watch in full. Kosta Novaković is important. He makes films like, one of the most fascinating, there's a film, the 550th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. And while people are familiar, perhaps, with the Battle of Kosovo, this kind of, and especially the films that were made later, particularly in the 80s, this period, looking at how they were done in the 30s, and the mix of documentary and fiction, this staged reality, but also a recorded reality, if you will, what's going on, the way this was experienced by people at the time. It offers a fascinating perspective on how people perceive their own history, but also contextualize it within the new Yugoslav country, which was forming for the first time, after centuries of occupation. And I would recommend exploring their films more beyond this. I would just like to say before I finally close with our main film for today and open up our floor for discussion, the main really reason why I'm telling you this, besides the fact that I would like to give you an idea of really the unique kind of, like I said, chapter in film history that is Yugoslav silent cinema, and this really exceptional methods towards professionalization filmmakers took, the kind of film culture developed, and the film schools that were the first film schools in the world that were opening in Belgrade and across the former Yugoslavia, and how this influenced, film production, means of film production, and film aesthetics is important. But the ultimate effect of it is, how does it influence film language? What do we have? What are the films saying? I mean, what these films do is they develop at a very early point. While now looking back, we're very used to some of these techniques, if you will, or these approaches. These approaches are championed very early on, often before their international compatriots do the same. And they facilitate a new means of expression for engaging with their subjects. This includes converging narratives, films, and this is also something pioneered in the Soviet Union, but this is something that's also kind of inherent to Serbian cinema heritage, but also the new Yugoslav cinema heritage, the way narrative was complicated aesthetically, and how we had, several different, both character narratives, but also different types of narratives connect within one film. Most fascinatingly, rifts and discontinuities is one kind of thing that's really special for these films, because often, like I said, some of these people were filmmakers who grabbed their cameras and went to film. So often you have incomplete films or films that are fragments. Sometimes this is because films are lost, but sometimes this is intentional, and this is fascinating to watch, to connect these two. There's always a sense of experiencing film anew, of looking at film for the first time, even if films aren't, even if some films aren't the most exceptional in themselves, the experimentation and the kind of sense of freedom that they instill in the viewer is just incredible. But nonetheless, having said this, there's fascinating and most pioneering kind of examples of the uses of film language in Yugoslav cinema. Deep focus cinematography is something I mentioned that was present as early as the 1910s. This is something that develops throughout Yugoslavia and is important for our film of today of With Faith in God. And it's important because it's this ability to communicate in a uniquely cinematic way, to use time and to convey time essentially as the molding material, what Tarkovsky would call of cinema, like the clay of cinema, and to convey and both to speak to human emotion, but to speak to deeper inner states, inner spiritual states. And this is again the subject of our film today, With Faith in God. Deep focus is again important because we have this ability of a filmmaker communicating on several layers of the frame. And that ability, that interplay gives us a sense of, a great consciousness of how to use film as a unique art, unique in itself, and also able to express and, reflect on life in a way unseen before. And finally, one thing I'd like to leave you with and connected with our film today, With Faith in God, the emergence of off-screen space. This is something I found specifically in Yugoslav silent cinema in my work and what I like to share with you. And this is the ability, the poetic ability of filmmakers to connect on-screen and off-screen space, what we see in the film and what's beyond the frame, what we don't see, what's indicated, as a kind of uniquely cinematic ability to speak through film language, to point to the frame as a kind of mediator, to point to the reality much bigger than the frame itself. To point, this is what I mean, what we call poetry in a way. And this is something that would only be done much later. Often filmmakers like Tarkovsky or his fellows in the 60s would say, this is the first time we'd have a truly poetic cinema, and filmmakers would want to break away from earlier forms. Even silent cinema would be later seen sometimes by many as like as something not quite developed yet. Silent films were just like the predecessor to their better compatriots who use cinema for poetic purposes. But in fact, films in Yugoslav silent cinema, which we're talking about today, and most importantly, a film like With Faith in God, there is a deep sense of poetry which stands, the test of time to even today, in what it says about the human condition and what it says about spiritual life in particular. And overall, this leads to the creation of a unique kind of cinematic space, which I'd like us to talk about. I'll stop with the presentation here. And when I speak everything I've spoken about, I'll try to channel it towards the main film of our discussion, With Faith in God, and the cinema of Mihajlo Popović. I'll stop sharing just now. So I hope this has been mostly, I mean, useful for you. I realize I've gone through a lot, but I hope we'll have a nice discussion now going on from here. But I think it's important to look at a film like With Faith in God. I should say also that With Faith in God is essentially a film when we look back at film history, and it's by film critics and people who specialize in film, it's seen as the most important, the greatest masterpiece of Yugoslav silent cinema, the greatest film of the interwar period. And if I can add, that really for me, and I think you will see the same, one of the most incredible and the most dynamic and most sincere treatments of spiritual life on film to this day. And it really has its only predecessor in the films of Andrei Tarkovsky. Now, I realize I would like to really leave some room for discussion. So, but just for those who didn't get a chance to watch With Faith in God, or to read the essay, which I again encourage you to do, you'll find a bit more, especially about the film, the analysis of the film. That's why I kind of, today I decided to speak more about the context, because I realized this was something I only briefly covered in the essay we published with Liberating Cinema. But whereas you had a lot of film analysis in the essay, which I'll leave you to go and read if you're really interested, but of course watch the film too. But just to give you an idea why this film is so important, it basically offers the perspective of a suffering of a family in rural Serbia during World War I. And it focuses on the everyday life of the villagers, and it gives the perspective of women and children who stayed at home, as opposed to the men who went to the front. And already this negotiation of on-screen and off-screen space is present in the very narrative. But in the way we kind of see it through the film develop poetically is beautiful, because we see this connection of people who aren't able to be together, those what we see and what we don't see, those who are here and those who are not. But we see that articulated through film language, and that kind of sense of, longing, of sadness, but also of joy is something that predominates in With Faith in God. And that's also connects to, the negotiation of on-screen, off-screen space, but also it's poetry. And it's also an antidote to a lot of films that speak about spiritual life in a very monotonous or even depressing way. And even some of the best films, which I wouldn't call necessarily monotonous or depressing, they're often masterpieces. Films like The Passion of Joan of Arc, which are hailed as, silent masterpieces, and still films which are cited by people about spiritual life. Nonetheless, there's something unique in With Faith in God. I mentioned this in the essay, but it offers this contrast of peace to suffering, and of this joy in the face of constant suffering and crucifixion, and in the face of total destruction. So, and the sense of hope. So I hope this, if you watch this film, it leaves you with this sense of hope and this sense of possibility of what the film medium can do. And why I shared with you Yugoslav cinema, apart from the just pure wonder of the films themselves, is because we look at it as a whole period in film history, a lot aren't familiar. Both film historians, film directors, both domestically and internationally, are not familiar with this incredibly vast and significant heritage that formed before the Second World War. The documentary tradition that was present, which we didn't have so much time to talk about here, but which I referred to, the documentary tradition, the film culture, the film schools, the methods of production, the really unusual methods towards professionalization, which all led to the creation of a unique film language and unique film culture, which would only blossom as time went on and would culminate, in the post-war Yugoslav period, when Yugoslavia would become a socialist country. But then also cinema would change radically too. But I think this is kind of a very important period to look at in film history, and one we can learn a lot from. So I hope you enjoyed the kind of presentation, the discussion we had, the talk I kind of shared with you today. And I'll leave kind of now time for questions, really, because I'm interested to see what you think, and to kind of see the different responses we might get. Thank you. Max, I'm going to ask you if you have any questions, because you joined us earlier on, and I'm glad to have you here with us. So for everyone else, Max is from the University of London. I'm really glad you're here. So do you have any, what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was actually writing in the chat that we actually need, it's a kind of serious need to decolonizing the pedagogical system in the universities, like in media departments, in cinema, because most of the time I wasn't very much involved in media teaching and cinema teaching, but in a very short course that I was involved, there wasn't any mention of Yugoslavia cinema. Although it was about third cinema, but there was a glimpse of what was second cinema, like European cinema. When they were talking about European cinema, it was just about France and I mean Italy. No mention of Yugoslavia, the history of film production, the amazing things you just talked about. And I was fascinated, and I was sad actually how illiterate we are in the in the academia. And what we actually learn is just there is this colonization of the European, apart from Hollywood, obviously everyone knows that. But when the discussion is about European cinema, we don't hear, unfortunately, that much about Yugoslavia cinema, and that's a serious need to talk more and have this kind of discussion and giving this enlightenment basically about the Yugoslavia cinema. And thanks for that. Thank you. It was very fascinating to know about the history and the history of film production in Yugoslavia. I feel really illiterate. I'm so sorry. I felt like I know nothing, and I was ashamed of that. So bravo, and continue this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxa. I'm so glad you joined, and I'm glad you were able to learn from it and find out more, because this is kind of I'm glad also you mentioned Yugoslav cinema and the third cinema especially, because the interesting thing really, after when Yugoslavia becomes socialist, it plays an immense role in kind of connecting what would become the non-aligned movement, and that's basically all the countries of Africa, South America, Central and South America, most of Asia, and so on. So, and I think it's kind of interesting because from the post-war Yugoslav context, the Second World War, post-Second World War, because we've spoken about the First World War here today. The post-Second World War context, very little is, even from that historiographical context, very rarely do we hear about, pre-war cinema, about the documentary tradition, especially because, it's a socialist regime. There's little talk of spiritual life, little talk about films about faith, presumably for these reasons. But nonetheless, Yugoslavia plays a big role in kind of championing the countries of the non-aligned movement, and plays a big role also in third cinema. It also develops, as one of the most distinct European new waves. But I think this period of all periods is one we know little about, and one I think we should know about, if we're to learn the history and then see the context of the later cinema that would come. Well, I think, what you've said, basically, I think you're right. And this is why I've kind of really found this research and the work I'm doing on this fascinating, and why I'd kind of like to continue to do more is because I've seen that people, haven't, at least since the breakup of Yugoslavia, very little work's been done kind of on Yugoslav cinema internationally, or at least it's been done in very selective ways, and often ones that kind of perpetuate, stereotypical or otherizing perspectives of the cinema that kind of, box it in a Balkanization context, which is totally, not the kind of context from which these films emerged.
Right.
So, and I think it's good to learn about the kind of film culture, like you said, and the film production and the films that developed at this time. So, and to put them in perspective also, I think, because to really see kind of the range when we look at Yugoslav cinema, if we step back, while I've talked about silent cinema, to see this beautiful interplay, of the early heritage before the 1918 to the silent cinema, to the particular kind of grassroots example of film production, to the examples of kind of faith in film, of spiritual life on film that we see in Yugoslav silent cinema, then the post-war socialist productions, and then also the kind of incredible kind of diversification of cinema that happens in the socialist Yugoslavia, because it wasn't all socialist, the ideological productions that you would imagine, but also, that kind of sense for experimentation, sense for something new, something creative, something original would continue.
It's very interesting, because I was going to ask you, because you said after the post Second World War, it becomes socialist. So it just came to my mind. So the cinema supposed to be more propagandistic, but then you just said that it was very diverse. There was many different voices, so it wasn't that much propagandistic after the Second World War. Perhaps. No.
This is so I haven't spoken. I thank you for this question, because I find it, like, for example, filmmakers like Mihajlo Popović, who's our main kind of filmmaker for today. He's and who you can learn more about, through the essay we published, and both through the film itself. he's somebody who never made another feature film after With Faith in God. He continued making documentaries. He was an incredible voice. You know, his film is the most incredible silent film ever, one of the most incredible, if not the most incredible silent film ever made. And yet he doesn't make films, but he continues to contribute to some of the most important voices that come after the Second World War, and some of the most important filmmakers of the post-war Yugoslav period. So it's interesting how, although these filmmakers were in a way sidelined, I'm not sure whether it's the subject of faith or, you know, other reasons, sometimes they were, they still play a big role in film production, you know, in the kind of the film culture that continues. So although subjects like faith, you know, in a way, I wouldn't say disappear, but just, you know, are, let's say, put to the side, or the ways of film production changes, you know, you have a nationalized studio system. Nonetheless, this sense for, you know, basically new voices, for diversity, for kind of creative approaches to film still dominate. I mean, like, the only period you really have pure, like, if you like socialist, kind of like socialist realist, what people like to say, filmmaking is like 1947 to 1950. It's like 4 years. So, and it's really, that's the only period. And even that period has its own discontinuities and ruptures. And one of the great examples I always like to cite, because very few people, you know, talk about this film now, perhaps for interesting historical reasons. There's a film called Mother Katina from 1949, which is basically made in 49 in Greece. It's made in Serbo-Croatian, but it's shot as in Greece, like it's in Greece, and it's about the potentiality of Greece to become a socialist republic. It's very, you know, socialist, and it's about this mother that almost represents, you know, the socialist project and the survival of the Second World War and the anti-fascist spirit. But it's a fascinating anomaly in film history, because Greece never became socialist. You know, that optimism, at least for socialism in the Greek context, is completely destroyed like a year or two after. So this film really, you know, becomes its own anomaly in a way, and that's why often I think films like this get written out of film history. We often want to see very clear-cut lines. You know, films were socialist propagandistic, that was it. But often, even within these films, we would label propagandistic. There were various layers and nuances when we look back at them. But I would say absolutely, there weren't. I wouldn't say it was clear-cut like that, because then later you would have films which are about partisans, and they weren't always the kind of pro-socialist epics that you imagine, even because they would also be very critical of the partisan struggle. They would also have very existential undertones, which I claim, and I mean, which if you look at Yugoslav cinema as a whole, carry their roots all the way to the 1910s, and nobody ever talks about that. You know, the very hard existential kind of flavor of the new wave, of Yugoslav new wave. If you have a chance to look at it, it's from the 60s. It's fascinating. But they're very difficult films. They're much more accessible, but they're very difficult, hardline films, and often ones which engage with death very much, and you know, with marginalized and they also engage with social subjects, but in a very, very critical way. I think they also draw their kind of they're also indebted to these early films, which if people, you know, even though if we don't like to say that, even if they didn't like to say or credit them at the time because of the subject of faith, that element, you know, for that concern about spiritual life, that existential dimension pertains and is developed and grows throughout.
So that spiritual aspect went to, let's say, periphery just for 4 years, as you mentioned, in post-war, and then it come back and dominated again.
No. So basically, like in the post-war, I said the socialists. So no, like films like in the post-war period, you would only have, I would say, like the first 4 or 5 years, like I would say for probably that were really socialist project films, let's say. One of the first Yugoslav films is called Slavica, and that's like the Slav lady. And that's kind of the really new, championing the really new distinctive Yugoslav socialism, the partisan struggle that was distinct to Yugoslavia, you know, that was crucial to the victory of the Allies in occupied Europe. So that's the kind of films. But no, I mean, these subjects would continue, they would diversify. I mean, partisans became part of, you know, representations, not just of films that were socialist or inherently like, you know, very, if you like, a little bit ideological, but they would also enter the avant-garde, animation, very critical films, very experimental films, and also films like the New Wave. So that's why I think when people talk about this distinction between, you know, let's say popular partisan cinema and the New Wave films, which are, you know, a representative of a European auteur cinema, there's not so much of a distinction because, you know, there's they're just different sides of, you know, these representations of partisans. of course, the new wave is, I mean, one of the most fascinating examples of political cinema and also very critical cinema. But at the same time, if you look at the bigger context, there's a much more nuanced picture of, representation of partisans, of socialism and of the reality. I mean, because all this comes down to is not, we talk about ideology, we talk about socialism, but all this comes down to is the reality which people live in their everyday life. So, and there's a much more kind of layered reflection of this. And this is why I think it's important to take a step back. And yeah, part of the reasons why I looked at silent cinema is because nobody ever talks about it, even with people's knowledge of like post-war Yugoslav cinema, they often restrict to, these divisions, new wave, partisan film. But even these distinctions aren't clear cut, and let alone nobody ever mentions the silent cinema. Yet the silent cinema is important. So because, it placed some of the most important foundations for like the further development of film and also film culture, because, film culture, like the Yugoslav film culture that you also have developing after the 50s is also one of the most vibrant, because now Yugoslavia opens up to the entire, if you like third world, I don't like the term, because I think that's also a colonialistic term. But I would say all the countries of the kind of, that aren't only representative of the West, but also across Asia, Africa, South America. And as it plays a kind of key political and social role, it also opens up the space for kind of figures and cinematic figures from these places to come to Yugoslavia and to create a really unique film culture, unique film production, network and language. And
yeah, exactly. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. I hope I answered you in a very elaborated way, but I hope.
Yes, you did. No, you did. Don't worry. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I encourage you, if you have time, to look at more about Yugoslav cinema, to find out more, and to join us for a film series, because part of this, Maxa and everyone else, one of the reasons kind of I find our film series so important is because we're, opening up this space where we can learn about, these hidden chapters of film history that are so important, and also these films that are to rediscover all these different chapters that make cinema so unique, a medium, and the film language so such a unique opportunity to create something new and refreshing and a take on life. So I think, I see we have a question. So does this, yeah, okay. I see we got a question, just a second, thank you. We have a question: what is the importance of Yugoslav cinema, and does the Serbian cinema exist prior to prior to Yugoslavia? Right, I maybe have a little bit more, if you can add a little bit more clarification on this question, what is the importance of Yugoslav cinema, but in terms of what respect you'd like me to answer. But one of the things why I find Yugoslav cinema so important is because, like I've said to Max already in response to her question, it represents one of the most diverse, poetic, and just incredible cinemas I've found in film history. So national cinemas, or even if we go internationally. So, and we have another colleague who's joining us. Thank you. Yes. So basically, it represents, for me, one of the most fascinating cinemas where a unique film culture developed, as I've kind of emphasized several times tonight. A unique film culture, and that developed very early on in film schools, where film schools opened well before in any of the major kind of, if we like to say, major economic powers today, and where aesthetic expression flourished from the grassroots. So that's why Yugoslav cinema is important, is this idea of cinema in the hands of the people. This is something that's in the 60s, championed by third cinema, but in Yugoslavia, this is being done in the 10s. This is not being done in the beginning. Actually, this is being done even in Serbia before. So yes, there is a Serbian cinema, and that Serbian cinema traces its roots to 1896. So that also ties. Now, as to, I think that's important to look at. So there's an immense wealth of Serbian cinema heritage that, precedes Yugoslavia, and that runs all the way through. So I think, and this is something else I think we should address, and maybe Max, I didn't tell you quite this, but with the emergence of new successor states, we often have this, I would say, politics of dividing the cinema based on the new states, which is total rubbish. Which is totally incorrect if we can be like more, put it more academically. And it's because this country existed as one country, and as you've seen, I hope I've been able to share with you, which existed as one country, and that the culture that developed as one, and the production kind of, and the kind of whole interplay, and the network that was fostered and created in Yugoslavia was one. So the idea of having 6 different national cinemas, although now there are new cinemas emerging, it doesn't quite apply here. And I think even in a treatise of Serbian cinema, we can go back to the very beginning of film. But then as we go on to talk about Yugoslavia, we can see the role, that, if you like, Serbs, or the role of Serbia in the championing of a unique Yugoslav cinema. And I think that's also applies to other, fellow countries that now formulate, that now forms the successor states, including like Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on. So, and the same would apply, I think. So, but with respect to Yugoslav cinema, this is what really makes it unique. And then after the Second World War, we have, the socialist, Yugoslavia becoming a socialist country, and a completely new kind of cinema developing. So, and one in which, although, like I mentioned, there are these socialist and potentially even ideological elements coming in, there's the state nonetheless facilitates the creation of an incredible studio system. Again, really one of the most fascinating in the world, and the opportunity for filmmakers to be truly creative and free in their work. And I think this applies to kind of regardless of what genre or movement, as we like to classify it today, they were working in. And most importantly, as connected to our subject tonight, this existential aspect, this concern for spiritual life, this concern for the spiritual, even in the social, pertained in the Yugoslav cinema even after the Second World War. Even though faith was formally banned or sidelined at best, these concerns still came in the films, and this is what makes Yugoslav cinema so unique. This element this ability to go further, and the filmmakers to go deeper. And I think this is something, whereas a lot of cinemas, stick. We won't say like only to the surface, but if they stick on the social aspects or the political aspects, this spiritual aspect is what singles out, or this dimension of the spiritual life is what singles out Yugoslav cinema and makes it so unique. And I hope, this is clear through Mihajlo Popovic's cinema, who, again, he's a filmmaker. We've spoken in very, why these films are so important, but he's somebody who made the film when he was 24. So, and that's just something mind-blowing. He's somebody, I would put alongside like filmmakers like Samira Makhmalbaf from Iran, or Jan Nemec from Czechoslovakia, or Orson Welles from the US, who all made films in like, very early age, but who made, the better films than some would make in their, in their late years. So, and this shows, like the methods of film production, that film must come from the soul, and is that what makes it unique? It must come from the personal experience and from something inside. And I hope that's kind of been clear to everyone tonight, and I hope through that you can learn more and find out more about these films. I'll also just say, in case anyone else wants to add anything, I'll also just say I can see we have Leandro here. I'm so happy he's here. Leandro Varela is here from Leandro. Hello.
Hello, Mina. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you. I'm glad you're here.
Of
It's a good point to introduce you as well. And we have another question. How does it compare to South American cinema? Now, I think there's a great overlaps between Yugoslav cinema and cinema from South America. And I don't want to be, closing it up in that bracket. I know that Argentinian cinema is something unique in itself, as we will see next week. So, and as are all the other cinemas of South America. So, but one of the connections, like I've said, apart from this dimension of third cinema that connects Yugoslavia to the cinemas of South America, there's also continuous, co-productions that were taking place between Yugoslavia and countries in South America, especially Argentina, and countries also Central America, like Mexico. That's another whole chapter we can go into. But it's also methods of film production, exchange, knowledge exchange, personnel exchange, people exchange, and also filmmakers from South America, from Africa, and different places coming to study in Yugoslavia and work there and continue to work there. So this constant dialogue is what connects, I think, and this constant concern also for a kind of this existential concern existential concern for kind of social life and for everyday life is also what connects. And I think our cinema of today that we spoke about to Argentinian cinema that we'll speak about next week. So, Leandro, I hope I haven't gone too far off. This is more your territory now. But you're going to talk to us about the Argentinian short film movement next week. And I'm really looking forward to it, because I think in the spirit of this self-organized creativity that we spoke about here today, and this filmmakers and cinema emerging from the grassroots, we can see more of that next week, through the short films that were made in Argentina between the 40s and 60s. So it kind of really connects, I think. Do you want to add anything? I hope I don't know what you, just before we kind of close up, I think if you want to introduce yourself or say anything, please do, or if you have any questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Leandro Varela. I work at the Film Museum in Buenos Aires, Pablo Krojiken. And no, I think you said it all. I mean, it's very, very clear. I mean, how all these different cinemas from different parts of, are connected in a certain way. And so, yeah, next week I was invited by Mina to talk about short film production in Argentina, and I will focus on the short film movement and a few predecessors to the short film movement, which came. The short film movement rose in the 50s and 60s, but there are a few predecessors in the 40s. So that's what I will be talking about next week.
Thank you very much, Leandro. I'm so glad you joined.
No, thank you.
And yes, good afternoon to Buenos Aires. So I think, yeah, I'm very glad you'll talk to us about that next week. We'll publish your essay. So Leandro's essay on the short film movement in Argentinian cinema will be published live on Liberating Cinema this week. And I hope you can join us next Monday to discover more about Argentinian cinema, about the short film movement. And then as we go on, you'll see in our full program what we'll be looking at. We'll be going on well through into November. So we'll have each week a different cinema and a different engagement. So, and I hope today the silent period connects well, both in production, aesthetics as we spoke about, but it will connect well to the kind of the war and post-war period that Leandro will talk about. So thank you everyone again for joining us tonight. We'll finish here and I look forward to seeing you next week and to Leandro's presentation. Please do come.